So guys, let's start drafting and cutting our half circular skirt for the sleeveless white dress. So we always begin by ironing the fabric before drafting and cutting. We will be drafting the circular skirt directly on the fabric. The next important factor to consider is the layout of the fabric. Here we are going to lay the fabric on the bias grain line. Before I lay the fabric on bias grain line, it is important to check if your crosswise grain line is straight. Here I find that the crosswise grain line is not straight enough for the layout. So I am going to trim off the little excess fabric that is not aligned straight with my crosswise grain line. This is a very important step for you guys to follow, because when you're going to do the layout on the bias grain line, then your sides will not match perfectly. Now let's fold the fabric at 45 degrees angle to get a perfect bias grain line layout. Now observe what I am doing here carefully so that you can follow the same steps and lay out your fabric effortlessly. After smoothing out the fabric, it's always better to start pinning the fabric before we complete the entire layout. This helps the fabrics to be held in place while we continue to lay out the fabrics. Always take your time to lay the fabrics on bias grain lines. Continue to pin the fabrics as you are laying the fabric. A detailed video on the concepts of making circular skirts is given in the description box below for your reference. Now let's start drafting the half circular skirt directly on the fabric. The formula to find out the waist circumference is waist circumference divided by 6.28 into 2 plus 1 inches of seam allowance. Using this formula, find out the radius for your waist circumference measurements. From the pivot point, let's mark the radius to draw the waistline of the skirt. I am using a non-dust tailor's chalk so it doesn't leave very dark marks and it doesn't stain my white fabric. The waistline must measure waistline divided by 4 plus 1 to 1.5 inches seam allowance. Okay, if not, what to do? Here my waistline is measuring less. So what I am going to do is I am going to slightly make the radius bigger and I am marking a circumference measurements just below the line that I already marked. Remember to add your seam allowance along with the waistline circumference, otherwise you will get a shortage of fabric and you will not have the seam allowance to stitch the fabric. We have completed drawing the waistline of our skirt. Measure the length from the waistline, adding your seam allowances and your hemline allowances. Mark a point on the hemline and take the tape again to the pivot point and measure that point. Now start marking with this new measurement. This is the hemline of your skirt. Start by cutting the waistline of the skirt. Pin the on-fold side of the skirt. Continue cutting the hemline of the skirt. You can stop cutting halfway through and then you can fold the fabric completely and continue cutting. I am moving the fabric only for the purpose of shooting the video. Do not move the fabric from the table whatsoever. Continue to cut the hemline of the skirt. This upcoming step is a very important step, so observe carefully. I am pinning the waistline of the skirt. Remove all the pins that is in the center fold as well as the hemline. Now hold the waistline and then gently lift the skirt and give the fabrics a gentle shake like this. This will make the skirt fall, and since this is a circular skirt, the grain line of the total skirt keeps changing. So according to the grain line, the stretch of the fabric also changes at several parts on the hemline. So we are going to slightly shake the fabrics and level the hemline again. You must follow this step if you do not want to end up having uneven hemline after we stitch the hemline. Now I have given enough shaking to the fabric. Now let's level the hemline. Mark the length from the waistline along with your seam allowance and the hemline allowance and start marking at regular intervals. Can you see that I am moving the tape from the waistline at regular intervals to mark the new hemline of the skirt? Cut on the new line that we just marked. This step is going to ensure that your hemline is going to be absolutely parallel to the floor. The skirt part is done and ready. Now let's repeat the same for cutting the circular skirt on a piece of lining fabric. Follow the same steps and lay the fabric on a bias grain line. Take your time to lay the fabric on bias grain line. From the pivot point, let's start marking the waist circumference. While marking the length, the formula remains the same, but you have to minus an inch or 2 inches so that after stitching the lining does not become longer than our original fabric. Continue to mark and cut the lining fabric. Now our lining part of the skirt is also done and ready. We still have to cut the facing fabrics as well as the bias strips to finish the armhole. I always like to finish the cutting part entirely before I go to the sewing process. Now place the neckline facing as I have shown here and cut it out of the microdot canvas. Now repeat the same for the back neckline facing. Remember that we had already cut the facing fabrics from the original fabric. So all we are doing here is just cutting the facings out of microdot canvas. Now our facing pieces are done and ready. The bias strips are the last pieces that I need to complete my pattern making process. You can also choose to cut the bias pieces from your original fabric. Here I don't have a big piece of original fabric, so I am planning to cut it on the lining fabric. So here the fabric layout is open and on a single layer. Match the 45 degrees angular line given on your pattern master and place it against the selvage or the straight grain line. Start drawing the line diagonally and draw parallel lines measuring 2.5 centimeters using the grid lines on the pattern master. So in simple words, I am marking parallel lines to the first line that I drew. Now cut the bias strips. Make sure that you have enough bias pieces to complete the armhole. With this, our pattern making process is complete. Now let's see the sewing in the next video. If you have doubts or queries, let me hear them in the comment box below.